So I'm going to be watching all the presenters, and what I'd like to do is ask each of them a question or two. We have about 20 minutes left, so I just want to make sure everybody keeps their comments limited. If somebody has an additional comment, if they can wave, then I think I'll be able to see you. So why don't we start off with this first question? And this is going to be directed to George. George, there's a growing consensus that new therapies, including vaccines, need to be tested for safety, efficacy, and effectiveness in people who are most likely to need them and benefit from them and get them. But as I look at Table 1s of recently published papers on vaccines relating to phase 1 and 2 trials, I don't see any study subjects that are even close to resembling my patients. And I guess the question I have, and I want you to comment on, is that something I should care about, or worry about? Will that be dealt with in phase 3? Maybe. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a very important question. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So basically, I think a lot of this comes from fear of risk, and I think, and again, we have a colleague who works in the pharmaceutical sector, biotech sector. I think there's a lot of concern when I talk to people who do these early phase studies. There's concern about exposing older adults, especially if they have morbidities, to particularly newly discovered drugs, okay, in terms of side effects. But I think the counter argument is very powerful, which is that there's a lot of missed opportunities in terms of drug discovery, validation, and ultimately proving efficacy. And I think the example of the vaccine development is very timely, particularly given the COVID situation. There's been a lot of concern about the fact that few of the trials currently underway involve older adults. And I think the reason it's particularly important is that if I were to speak, for example, to influenza, what we know about influenza vaccination, where our group does done a lot of work, and increasingly with pneumococcal, it's become clear that the way older adults, particularly those who are frail, who are the most vulnerable, respond to the vaccine is quite different, for example, in terms of the contribution by cell-mediated immunity versus humoral immunity from younger people. And so, for example, the outcome markers that are used for vaccine studies in younger people based on antibody titers do not work well in older adults. So the bottom line is you should care. As a clinician, you should care. And I think as those of us who work in science, I think it's absolutely critical that that older adults be included in these studies, even the earliest stages. And the last thing I want to say is that when it comes to geroscience-guided therapies that many of us are increasingly involved in, where we're targeting biological aging as a way of influencing multiple chronic diseases, the opposite is true. If you don't include, it's the opposite of discrimination. We're actually focusing on aging. And if you don't include older adults in early phase 1 and phase 2 studies, you have no idea if these drugs are going to work later, because we believe they're not going to work in young people. They're going to work much better in older people.
Anybody else want to make a brief comment about that?
I mean, I'll jump in if you don't mind. I think, just in general, I think those points are very well made. I think in general, we, and now I'm putting my pharmaceutical hat on as opposed to my clinician hat. Oftentimes these phase 1 studies are done not in patients, but in healthy volunteers, right? Specifically because we're trying to really fully understand, the side effect, the safety profile of the drug. So sometimes we don't even start with patients. We start with healthy volunteers. But I mean, the points are well made that eventually I think these data are needed.
One more point. I think, as George was saying with the influenza, the thing we learned was the dose was absolutely wrong for older adults. And that would be, a stage 2 trial. So definitely need to have older people at that point, because there's no point in giving them a drug that's not going to work.
Okay, I'm going to move on now. Marie, what will NIH do to assure adequate inclusion of older adults in research? My understanding is that compliance with the NIH inclusion across the lifespan policy only requires that researchers say they will not exclude older adults. And we all know how easy it is to exclude older adults implicitly through a variety of inclusion and exclusion criteria. So any thoughts about how NIH will address this?
We're very cognizant of that potential challenge, and thus we are very interested in getting as many scientists as possible to participate in this inclusion across lifespan 2. And thank you, Jerry, for chairing one of our panels for that. We anticipate that there will be publications in peer-reviewed journals that will come from that to help disseminate some evidence-based practical advice to allow scientists to be more compliant. And we intend to monitor and monitor aggressively what's happening, not only as progress reports are being submitted and program officers are being charged to see whether the scientists are meeting expectations, meeting their goals for recruitment, but also as we start getting those progress reports in from the studies that were funded from 2019 onward, we will be looking at the data that's reported with regards to age, and we will, another provision of the 21st Century Cures Act is posting of data with regards to demographics by disease condition, and we're hoping as the age data become available to also post those data. So transparency, monitoring, those are the sorts of things that we're looking forward to.
Thank you. So Roseanne, when we think about inclusion of older adults in clinical trials, we can think about demographic characteristics like age, sex, race. But you mentioned a bunch of other things, and others mentioned a bunch of other things like functional status, cognition, frailty, burden of multimorbidity. And any thoughts about how to prioritize these things? Because it can get kind of overwhelming in this inclusiveness issue and trying to improve the heterogeneity of clinical studies. So thoughts about that?
I guess, everybody has their favorite. I think for me and my patient population, it's the multimorbidity, because most of my patients have additional medical conditions and are on other medications. I know that makes it very hard to be sure in terms of efficacy. You're going to have a lot more heterogeneity, but these are the people who are going to get the medications afterwards. So I would start with trying to figure out if exclusion criteria, why the exclusion criteria are there, and does it really make a difference in being able to do the study and interpret the results? So that would be my first. I think the second, as the Spridge study showed, and George mentioned in his editorial that I mentioned, the concepts of all of these different frailty indices and some which require physical, actually being with the patient and looking at their physical function, others of which contain cognition, some of which don't contain cognition, that I think these really are confounded at the moment. And I think we need to get a better sense of what is the, ideally, the minimal panel that we can use to measure in older adults so that we get a sense as to whether there is a population that is unlikely to benefit or if there is a population that is really likely to have adverse effects. And I think that may change depending on the drug and the treatment that we're considering, the disease and the treatment.
Any other comments about that? Okay, thank you. Kate, we know Biogen has placed a lot of focus on treatments for Alzheimer's disease. And we know what that population is very diverse, and they're in very diverse settings. So following up on your presentation, how can we make it easier for older adults to be included in R&D efforts? Is it always necessary to make them come to us? Should we be going to them? And I guess in the current era, since a lot of people with Alzheimer's disease reside in nursing homes, do you have any thoughts about even the ability to go into nursing homes right now at this very moment to do clinical research?
Yeah, I mean, when you say in this very moment, I'm assuming you're referring to the COVID pandemic that we have currently going on. It's a very difficult situation that we're currently in. I think if we could maybe, hopefully this pandemic passes in the near future, and we think about what could we do in a setting where it's actually, you can go into these different care settings. And I definitely think that this is something where we will be moving for the older populations that are in these different care settings and it's an interesting thing that the pandemic is actually maybe serving as a catalyst for us to think differently about how we can do trials. And the fact that we have been pressed into thinking about what assessments can we actually do remotely, or what can we do with healthcare providers that are in these settings that can help. So I do think that this pandemic will force us to stretch and change how and consider differently potentially where we can do these clinical trials. We're in the midst of it right now. I don't know where we end up, but absolutely it's causing us to think about what we can do remotely and what we can do in other care settings.
Roseanne, any thoughts about this?
I think that the studies that we've done on geriatric syndromes in particular have shown us that patients are much more likely to be involved. Now, obviously, it's a different condition, but they're more likely to be involved if you come to them. And it's easier because somebody doesn't have to take time off work usually. You don't have to worry about the travel. And you don't have to worry about the weather, which a lot of people get very concerned about. So I guess the more that you can go to them, like we're now doing hospitals at home, the more likely I think it would be that some people would participate who might not otherwise. And that's not just for people who are unable to leave the house, quite honestly.
George?
I'm just going to add that when we talk about heterogeneity, it also applies, I think, to decisions that older adults make. And I think everything I heard was true. At the same time, we've also seen the opposite. We've seen during COVID, in the worst days of COVID, we're a site for a multi-site hip fracture study involving exercise and testosterone replacement. And we had subjects who, in their 80s, who wanted to come on our campus and continue with their training while we were shut down, and really went through extraordinary measures to participate. So I think it really depends on the individual, and also depends, I think, what the study offers. I think we've known for many years that studies that actually offer something a potential benefit like exercise or some intervention of potential benefit typically have less of a difficulty recruiting as opposed to study that are more interested in mechanisms, if you will, or observational.
Marie, any thoughts about this? A comment has come in that it'd be nice to know the NIA perspective on this, and these approaches of meeting the study subject where they are cost more money. And is the NIA thinking about that in terms of funding and budgets, et cetera?
Not only is NIA thinking about that, but all of NIH, because again, this policy about inclusion across the lifespan is an NIH-wide policy. As it was being put forward, as we were thinking it through at NIH, that was an issue that was raised. It will be more expensive to do studies. But if the results of the data are to be generally applicable, then it's expected that the principal investigator or the investigator team will ask for the resources that they really need to be able to do an effective job of bringing people into the study. Quite honestly, there have been some analyses done that have demonstrated that some of the lower cost clinical studies where, perhaps people are trying to make it in at $499.99, so they don't go over the $500,000 limit that requires special permission for submission, often don't yield as significant a set of outcomes as your larger studies that are properly funded and properly powered to be able to answer the questions that are being asked. So yes, it may well be more expensive, but it's the right thing to do. And hopefully the scientific review groups will take careful look at what's being proposed and whether things are appropriate that are being asked, and that the institutes and centers will allocate the appropriate funds to make that happen. And then just going back to that issue about bringing things into the home, we fund, we are the leaders in funding of Alzheimer's disease research for the federal government, and we're very excited about the possibilities that are developing for blood tests that might be able to track people who are at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, and that could potentially be a real game changer in terms of being able to do the sorts of studies that are necessary. Because right now, yes, you can go into the home, but a lot of things many times need very expensive scans and spinal taps, et cetera, as Catherine Dawson mentioned. And when we get to the point that there's a good blood test or two or three that can be used in the research setting, that could potentially open things up quite a bit for those sorts of studies.
Thank you. So Kate, this last question is going to you, and we're running out of time, so this might be a yes or no answer on your part.
Okay.
So the FDA pediatric exclusivity provision has been very successful, or seemingly very successful, in generating pediatric studies on many drugs and a lot of new information and product labeling. Do you think the pharmaceutical industry would respond to a similar incentive program applied to this issue of including older adults in clinical trials? Would they respond to this this carrot, a carrot like that?
Without, speaking from my own opinion, I think that it was effective because it is a good carrot. So, I think that it is possible that this type of exclusivity increase due to geriatrics that is a potential for being helpful.
Any other perspectives on that? Do we need carrots? Okay, no comment. I think we do. So at any rate, this has been a great discussion, fantastic presentations. I want to really thank the presenters for their efforts in putting together this session 1 program. And I just want to let everybody who is on the Zoom to know that we are going to take about a 12-minute break now. We'll resume in, I guess, 40 minutes after the hour, wherever you are. And the next panel will be moderated by Dr. Jonathan Watanabe, and the session will be called Concomitant Illness and Polypharmacy, Opening Key Barriers. So we'll welcome everybody back in about 10 minutes. Thank you.